Here we go. Well, it seems appropriate to talk about heroic women this month. It's a month has been set aside to celebrate women and their work and contribution to society. And on Tuesday, it's International Women's Day. So it's just a couple days away. We almost hit it perfectly. I want to thank my wife, Deborah Catherine Fedowa, who called my attention last fall to the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. It was quite a big deal back in 1911. And Debbie spoke about the fire. Her talk that she gave in the fall was a little bit different than one here. She talked about the trial, the resulting trial, but we're going to talk more about Frances Perkins. So let's go to New York City. And some of you, probably any tourist who's been to New York will know about Washington Square. It's a pretty famous location. It's in Midtown. And the arch there that's in Washington Square is a pretty famous landmark. And the Ash Building is over here to the right. It's not even a block off of Washington Square. This is in the Greenwich Village area. And all these buildings nowadays, I think, or most of them, are part of NYU. Now, the Ash Building in those days was part of the Garment District. Garment District now has moved a little bit more further north. But we see Washington Square Park here off to the left. And a great many, if not all, the employees came from the Lower East Side. Bill Letter's extended family came and they emigrated from Eastern Europe and settled, like so many did, new people into the United States. They came and lived in the Lower East Side. It was cheaper there, and it was not very comfortable. I remember talking to Bill's dad, Herman, when he was a member of our group, and he said that he used to deliver cigars. That was a job that he had. But the garment workers had a good distance to walk from this section south of Delancey Street over to Washington Square. And of course, they would be penalized if they didn't make it. And they didn't make a lot of money, and it was a difficult life. Well, let's talk for a minute about Frances Perkins. Her life was a little bit easier than them. She was born in Boston, but she always associated with Maine. Her parents were from Maine. And there is a museum there in Maine dedicated to her. Her parents were middle class, but they came up with enough money. Maybe they borrowed, I don't know, but they sent her to Mount Holyoke, which is west of Boston, near Springfield, Massachusetts. And it's one of the Seven Sisters. It's a women's college, quite prestigious, still today as it was in 1911. And it was certainly unusual for a woman to go to college in those days. But she got a BS in chemistry and physics, and she was elected class president when she graduated. She, after graduation, she went and taught for a while in a school north of Chicago, Ferris, and it later became Lake Forest College. I have a cousin who graduated from Lake Forest College. And Frances often went into Chicago and realized that she really liked social work. I think she must have taught chemistry and physics when she did her teaching, but she realized afterwards that social work was something that she really felt the need to do. She was in Philadelphia for a couple of years and picked up some education. She realized that economics was going to be important for her. And later on, a couple of years later, she received a master's degree in econ from Columbia College, now Columbia University. I wanted to mention that when she was in Chicago, she worked for a while part-time at Hull House, Jane Addams' famous social work building where they tried to help the immigrant women who tend to move to bigger cities and to help them with their lives. Well, in the Ash Building, in the garment district, this is what the women and some men and some children were producing. These are shirtwaists, and they were very popular around the turn of the century. If you look to your right, you can see what they look like. These are Gibson girls, these models, these drawings. Charles Dana Gibson drew these, and they were considered the ultimate in feminine beauty. And even today, I think these are a very attractive kind of material for a blouse. And the patterns were set in Paris, and the Triangle Shirtwaist factory that was in the upper 3 floors, 18th, 19th, or 8th, 9th, and 10th, that's where these women worked in large numbers. Here's a picture of some of the people who are working there. You'll see some males here and there, but these 2 guys are the owners. And looking back at this picture, I think this woman must be one of the wives because she's clearly not dressed for work in a factory. And she's overly dressed here a little bit. We'll come back to this picture later. I've got 3 pictures that show you a little bit of what it's like working in that factory. Originally, when I borrowed this photo, it said it was taken earlier in the day of the fire, but this looks different from, I think, the Shirtwaist factory, but it gives you an idea what it was like. And I say it's different because in the ceiling, there is a sprinkler system. Although in the Shirtwaist factory, really what they depended on for fires is this bucket over here on the wall. And they did have a fire escape over there. And it must have been at the start of the day because these ladies down the line here don't have the material. It's a real thin cotton material that they were using. This picture, a little bit out of focus, is taken later in the day. And you can see the material bunching up here. There's things on the floor. They had children, I bet, well, they employed children in this factory. And I bet they were the ones who swept up the floor, collected it. There's some hampers here for extra material, but there's always a lot of extra material in such an enterprise. These men here in the right are cutting out patterns. And for that kind of work, they were paid more than the women. Here's this picture, the final one I've got to show you is you can see some detritus here collecting. And the women are using standard sewing machines here at this particular one. And they worked a 54-hour week, if not more. Now, on that day of the fire, it was March 21st, 1911, March 25th, sorry. And Frances was in a restaurant with some friends having tea. This was a Saturday afternoon. This was part of the regular work week for the women and the others working in the factory there in the garment district. And they heard the fire alarm going off and the fire trucks speeding to the location. And of course, like anybody, they got up and they wanted to see what was going on, where it was. And they didn't have very far to walk to see the people. And the firemen had a little trouble finding a fire hydrant that had an adequate pressure. They had no booms in those days, 1911. So all they can do is really sort of get to just inside the windows on those upper floors, as you can see here. This is an actual photograph there on the right of from that day. And as Frances approached the building, she saw people throwing bundles of clothing out of the window. And she thought, well, this must be the designers up there wanting to save their material that they've designed from the fire. But when she got a little closer, she realized they were human beings who were jumping from the windows to avoid being killed by the fire, a terrible death. This may remind you of 9/11 when people jumped from the Twin Towers. And of course, it held the firemen up a little bit because they would kill people on the down below if they were hit by the people jumping from up above. And of course, everybody was looked at this terrible scene and was astonished. Here's some pictures of how it got started. They believe it was in the 8th floor. And it may have, the theory was that somebody put a cigarette or a cigar into a container that had pieces of material. It was real thin cotton, and it would have been very flammable, easily started by such an act, a cigarette or cigar. And the flames went outside the windows and quickly claimed a fire in the next floor up. Here's a good drawing here that shows where it was, cutting rooms down here in 8th and 9th, sewing machines. Think of this holding 400 people in these 3 floors. There was a problem contacting the 9th or the 10th floor from the 9th. There was a telephone, but they couldn't get people to answer. It wasn't expected that there'd be calls, so they had trouble contacting people on the 10th floor. There was a passenger elevator here, and the elevator operator, they had to have an operator in those days, he came up and got 13, 14 people each trip and took them down. But after his 3rd trip, it was no longer safe, and he couldn't get up any longer. There were survivors who made it up on the roof, and the people in the adjoining building, it was not a great distance across there, but they got ladders and things and put them across the gap between their building and the building where the fire was occurring. And people were saved that way. So people came to their aid. But quickly the fire spread to all the exits, and there wasn't, the people were trapped on these early floors. I found that this seemed to capture some of the, what the women and the other employees dealt with. Then the walls began to smolder and burn. Fire was everywhere. The pools of fire met, roared up under each table. Ranks of fire marched forward relentlessly, driving the doomed along toward oblivion. The dressing rooms were in flames. Women were plunging into the elevator shaft after the elevator could no longer get up. They took that way out. Bodies were tumbling, the windows entangled. This was a 0 moment. At that point, nothing survived. Here you see the Fire escapes, they were poorly built. They were designed to hold just a couple of people. And quickly the ladies crowded onto this, and they collapsed a couple floors down, and everybody fell down to the concrete pavement. This is a skylight designed to let in some sunlight into the storage area under the pavement. And the bodies came down and broke through these skylights. Here you can see the result of the fire. In the how hot it was, and scorched everything, bent the metal, and nobody could survive if they were trapped in these upper floors. Afterwards, the body were moved to a morgue, and the relatives had to come and try to find their mothers, their sisters, in some cases their children. And they would look for jewelry that they knew their loved one had gotten, maybe as a gift. Look in their hands and around their necks to see if they could spot anything that would indicate who was who. There were about 18 people whom they could not identify for several years, actually. They finally did identify everyone. But they couldn't do dental in those days. These women, if they had gone to dentists, nobody knew where the dentists were or whether their records were kept for them. So it was very difficult to identify these people. This chronology shows how quickly it all occurred. From the beginning to the end was a half an hour. 4:45, it begins, people begin jumping. See, the firemen initially had nets, but bodies from such a high altitude, up higher above them, quickly tore through the nets, and they abandoned those, the firemen did. Once the firemen got into the building, they quickly raced up the stairs. There were stairs there. And they were able to get the fire under control. But everybody who had been still in the building was lost. Well, here we have the two owners we saw before, and they were indicted for these deaths. And they went to trial just a month after the fire occurred. And the accusation, the prosecutors were focused on a locked door that they often kept this locked during the daytime. Well, they're always at night, but during the daytime, because the owners thought the women were going out there and stealing. They would steal material. They would hide it, I guess, under their coats. And somehow they would give them an opportunity to steal. So often the door was locked to prevent that from happening. And in the trial, the judge told the jury, focus on that lock. Was it really locked? And at least one, maybe a couple of employees said they had opened the door, but people had not gotten out. So that was where the essential conflict was. You see, they couldn't really accuse the owners of not having sufficient fire prevention materials because there were no laws for that. It was the laws were lax in those days, and that's why, of course, Frances took it upon herself and others working with her to produce changes that would make it safer for people working in industry. The concept was really, we are in a capitalist society and the owners can do what they wish to hire and fire people. If An owner of a factory can find people willing to work for a less hourly wage, then that's capitalism. People who have read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle will recognize a lot of these actions in the early part of the 20th century. Here we have the owners listening to in the trial, and the big headline, "Triangle Heads Acquitted." Of course, it led to a lot of parades and complaints, and it really sort of electrified the people in New York, particularly in the garment working business. And it made a major change. It was like 9/11 for 1911. And it spurred people to action. And of course, it was a struggle because the factory owners were very powerful people. And I should mention that factories often caught on fire in those days, but there was usually not any loss of life. And it occurred because the factories had an oversupply of certain fabrics, certain materials. The times had changed and no longer were shirtwaists popular. And so miraculously at nighttime or on a Sunday, the factory would start on fire and the owners would collect the insurance. But these fires didn't very often occur when people were around. Well, Frances here in this long coat that does not look very attractive, and I think she is wearing it, I'm guessing, because she was working, she had taken a job with the Factory Investigation Commission, and she didn't want to go into a factory that looked like she would be well-dressed. She knew what effect a woman's clothing has on people around her, and she wanted to go in there and talk to the laborers and find out what's going on. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, not Franklin, but Theodore, had recommended Frances to be on this committee on safety. That was right after the fire. So she was well known. She had been on commissions in New York State, and she had been in Albany for some years and had made a name for herself. And so it was only natural that she would be called upon to investigate some of this particular atrocity. Well, what happened with the fire? It's 2 years later with the New York workers' comp law, unions grew, and I can't see from my screen, but the ILGW grew. That's the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. That fought for improvements to the women's lifestyle. They were, women were docked, it was boring work and took long hours. And the women, if they went to use the restroom, they had only a short amount of time. And the Department of Labor began enforcing new labor laws. So it spurred on a lot of corrections. And as it says down here, the fire convinced the nation that the government had a responsibility to provide safe working conditions. But still, it was many years before we had OSHA, 1970. Here's a piece of trivia about Frances' name. Frances could be male or female. The difference is in the spelling. If it's ES, it's for female, and IS, like Frances lied. Some of you people will remember a colleague from the humanities department. His name was spelled IS. This is a quote from Frances. She said, "The New Deal began on March 25th, 1911, the day that the factory burned. It made such an impression on her and on the country." The New Deal, of course, during the Franklin Roosevelt administration, and laws to help the laborer, the common man. and woman. Well, when Frances was working in Albany, New York, she met, of course, the people there. It's even today, it's a heavily Democratic state. And she met an up and coming young lawyer, Francis Delano Roosevelt. And she said initially, I thought he was pretty snooty. He came from a money background. He was a lawyer, but didn't practice law. He thought politics was more of his forte, what he would excel in. And she said he would cock his head back. And of course, he had a cigarette holder. And he would look down to his nose at people. And that turned her off. But then in the 1920s, early 1920s, he changed. And Frances figured out the reason was that he caught poliomyelitis, which made his legs useless. He had to put mechanical apparatus on his legs to hold him upright, and he could no longer walk by himself. He required someone to help him. And of course, as a politician, you don't want the voters to see you with any limitations that are obviously evident here. So they used great methods to not to show this. This is an unusual photo showing Franklin Roosevelt standing with something to help hold him up. And he changed from that. He became more compassionate, she says, and she learned to respect him. And this feeling was mutual. Here's a pretty well-known picture here of Franklin with a young girl, taken much later, probably in Georgia at the Southern White House. The other, now Franklin returned to public life, and this picture opportunity was probably around that time. He ran for governor of New York in 1928, and he succeeded. The previous governor was Al Smith, this man here to the right. And Al Smith was a mentor of Frances as well, and she loved him dearly. An older man, and he ran for president in 1928. And he lost in a landslide. Much of the reason why people believe was because Al Smith was a Roman Catholic. And I remember in 1960 hearing about this and the same arguments during when Kennedy was running for president in 1960, that if he's elected, the Pope will move into the White House and begin running the country. So that really defeated Al Smith, and maybe there were other reasons as well. He had a strong connection to Tammany Hall, the political organization in New York City. But Tammany Hall was changing. I know we think of that as a pretty negative kind of thing, power brokers, but they were beginning to see that helping the immigrant families was really very popular with people, with all sorts of people. And so Tammany Hall was even changing, but Al Smith lost the 1928 election to Herbert Hoover. Well, and then we have the Depression. And Frances wrote, but with the slow menace of a glacier, Depression came on. No one had any measure of its progress. No one had any plan for stopping it. Everyone tried to get out of its way. And I picked this particular picture. It's all men here waiting for some free coffee and donuts. Of course, they have nothing to do. They have no jobs. And I thought, well, we need to include a mother here. For women, it was equally as hard, if not more so. They had the children to care for with a declining amount of money. This is, of course, a famous photo by Dorothea Lange, a migrant mother. And in the 1932 election, Franklin ran against Herbert Hoover, and he was elected in a landslide. And he went to Frances and said, Frances, I want you to be my Secretary of Labor. And she said, well, all right, but I have some personal family limitations. And she had married Paul Wilson, and they had a daughter. Both Paul and the daughter Susanna had mental illness problems. But and no doubt Frances, with a position over thousands of people, was gone a lot. But Roosevelt said, I want you here running my Department of Labor. I know what kind of person you are, what you're capable of. And Frances said, the people are what matter to government, and the government should aim to give all the people under its jurisdiction the best possible life. Well, she made it onto Time magazine. And once later, while she was Secretary of Labor, a photographer came in and said, Ms. Perkins, would you take your hat off so I can photograph you? And she said, no, I always wear a hat. I'm leaving it on. And of course, it's in her drawing as well. Now, all the pictures I've shown you show her in dark clothing. And she said to the politicians, there was a dearth of young, attractive women who were the ones that the males always wanted in their offices as secretaries and as other workers. And Frances said to them, if you would bring in the people who were competent instead of looking for flashy females, you would find there's no problem in finding enough individuals. She wore dark clothing well, nowadays we'd say it's a little bit dowdy. And she said, I have thousands of males who I must supervise. And I want them to look at me not as an attractive female, but as their mother. She figured that this relationship would be more effective in getting the men under her to do what she wanted them to do. Well, one of the duties of the Department of Labor is to be over the immigration department, the INS, really, what we have now. And to give you an example of some of the tough decisions in the late 30s and during the war, they had all these people in Europe that, well, the Holocaust, I don't know if the people in Washington really were aware of the extent of that. But many people were trying to get out of Europe. And Perkins' hands were limited to a certain number of people she could bring in. There was an allotment by the government. And they would write to her and say, please let in my family or this particular person or that person. And she tried to think of different ways of increasing the numbers of people allowed in, but it was very difficult. One of the people she did allow in the late 30s was this man. Do you recognize him? It's Sigmund Freud, of course. She said this man is famous, physician, and she signed off on allowing Sigmund Freud, who was from Austrian. And there was another family, a large family from Austria, that she also agreed to work to get in, and that was the Von Trapp family. Here we have Frances shaking hands with some workers with Carnegie Steelworkers in 1933. She had a strong relationship with these common laborers. She worked tirelessly to improve their lives, to help them out. There's an anecdote that in the late 30s, there was a big strike at General Motors, and she called at 2 a.m, probably from her desk. She called up the president of the company and chewed him out, said, it's time for you to compromise and stop this trouble with your workers. And I don't know if it changed his mind, but it certainly was aware of something of what kind of a leader she was. Well, Frances was also criticized because she was a woman. She was taking a job that a man might have. And regarding this, she said, the door might not be open to a woman again for a long, long time. And I had a kind of duty to other women to walk in and sit down on the chair that was offered, and so establish the right of others long hence and far distant in geography to sit in the high seats. Well, here's the most famous picture with Frances standing behind President Roosevelt, signing the Social Security Act of 1935. An act, she was not the only person involved in this. It was a major undertaking, but she was one of the major figures. And I love the title of this book about Frances Perkins, The Only Woman in the Photo. Isn't that a great title? With the implication that there should be other women there, but by God, Frances Perkins was there. Here's a great, this is a biography of her. I thought it was a nice rendition of her with her hat and her common clothing. But here in the background, you see the triangle fire. Well, she and Harold Ickes were the only two people who remained in their position through the entire Roosevelt administration. When Roosevelt died in the early part of his fourth term, she, of course, sent in her letter of resignation, as was appropriate, and President Truman accepted it. But he said, Frances, I really would like you to take on the Civil Service Commission. I'd like you to be on that commission. It's very important. And she reluctantly agreed to take it. And it was a tough job because it was in the late 40s. It was the time of the Red Scare, House Un-American Activities Committee, and everybody seemed to be suspicious of everybody else. And she had to, she said, I try to be fair. When someone is accused of being a communist, I go and I say, were you really? And they say, no, I wasn't. I don't remember signing anything. Many people signed cards when their friend said, here, sign this, it will help our cause. And they were dismayed later to realize they had signed this, and they wanted a job. So one of the questions in those days was, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And they said no. And then when Frances talked to her, they had to admit they apparently were. I didn't know what I was signing. And she said, well, you committed perjury by saying you were never a member. And so some of the people she couldn't help. One of the individuals that caused her a great deal of difficulty in the Civil Service Commission was a man named Harry Bridges. He was a very effective leader of a longshoremen's union on the West Coast. And Harry Bridges was predicted to be a member of the Communist Party, and it later turned out to be true. but he didn't lose his job. He was powerful. And I remember when the debate was whether to bring in Hawaii as a state, and people who were opposed to this said, well, you got people like Harry Bridges who have a great deal of influence there, communist influence. Maybe we shouldn't let in Hawaii. But fortunately, they voted that down. Well, finally here, I wanted to talk about the building named for Frances Perkins before when she was in the Department of Labor. It was the people in that echelon of government were scattered all over Washington. And by the 50s, they said, we got to have our own building. There wasn't much space, but we got to bring everybody together, sort of like moving the humanities department into one building from being scattered all over the campus. And they dedicated to her. Part of the building is over one of the interstates ahead in order to find enough space for this. But in the lobby, they say some of the things she's famous for: the New Deal, Social Security, Civilian Conservation Corps, many things that she did that were successful. The old Ash building still stands. It's probably gone over many times since 1911. It's now part of the NYU campus, and it's called the Brown Building. There is a plaque on the side of the building saying this is where the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire occurred. Seems to be appropriate to end this remembering the women. These are immigrant women from at least 2 generations. And I think that this talk should end with a memory of them, of their hard work under very difficult times.